Dan Chase, an ex-CIA agent presumed dead by the agency, wakes up from a dream about his late wife and receives a phone call from his daughter, Emily, who's curious about his well-being. After allaying her fears, he takes his dogs, Dave and Carol, along with him for a checkup, and also asks the doctor about his cognitive test. Though the doctor says he's fine, Dan's still doubtful given that his wife, Abby, died from Huntington's disease in the wake of a 6-year spell of severe dementia. Later that night, a strange man breaks into his home and gets attacked by Dave and Carol. Upon apprehension, Dan, frightened by the prospect of being discovered by the CIA, quizzes him. Eventually, he kills the man when he doesn't get an answer. Afterwards, Dan calls the police and abandons the house, informing his daughter of his decision. Meanwhile, Harold Harper and the present FBI assistant director has been assigned to retrieve Dan given their shared history. Rather than stick to the mission, Harold decides to help Dan disappear. After informing his old colleague that he's been followed, he advises him to shake off the men on his tail and disappear, leaving even his daughter behind, as the FBI could use her to find him. At the safe house, Harper's decision to help Dan draws suspicion from Waters, another agent assigned to the same case. When Dan then learns that disappearance means he would never get to see Emily again, he turns around, kills the FBI agents on his tail, and phones Harper with a threat to kill anyone sent after him or his daughter. The next morning, Harper and Waters arrive at the scene where Dan killed their men. While there, Waters lets Harper know that his dodginess in the previous day's task makes him believe there's a personal relationship between him and Dan. But Harper calmly deflects his suspicion and leaves. Meanwhile, Dan leaves a message for his daughter, informing her that he'd need some time to recover and start up a new life. Then he goes out of town, rents a place under a new name, and meets Zoe, a divorced and single parent, with the two of them eventually growing close to each other. Bothered by the recent interest in Dan Chase, Harper decides to get some answers from Boat, the soon-to-be retired FBI director and father figure to both Harper and Dan. Harper understands the recent hunt for Dan is spurred by an old betrayal. However, he asks Boat why the person who was betrayed, an Afghan warlord called Faraz Hamzad, returns after 30 years, with Boat telling him it's all part of Hamzad's revenge plan. When Harper then lets him know he tried to help Dan disappear, for fear Hamzad might find out that he had assisted Dan in the betrayal, Boat gives him a number. Harper returns to his office afterward and tasks FBI agents Joe and Adams with finding more about Emily Chase. While things simmer at the FBI, Dan revels in the life occasioned by his new identity. On the way back home from a date with Zoe, they get pulled over by the police. To save Dan from further scrutiny, Zoe passes him off as her husband. But they get caught on camera. Back at Harper's office, he receives info from Agent Adams that Emily has been dead for a long time, which is outright false since Dan still has contact with his daughter. As the agents continue to talk, Joe sends Harper a file containing Dan and Zoe's photo, captured at a police checkpoint. After being given Zoe's address, Harper calls the number Boat gave him and sends its owner, Julian Carson, a mercenary after Dan, in hopes of burying his involvement. Though Harper has sent Carson after Dan, he tries to secure the mission by also sending an FBI SWAT team after Dan. Meanwhile, the connection between Dan and Hamzad is revealed, as 30 years ago in Afghanistan, Dan had convinced Hamzad and his wife that he could help them in their war against Russia, regardless of the US's lack of help towards their plight. Back to the present, Dan reveals his true identity to Zoe and tries to get her to leave with him to Montana. However, she's already frightened and immediately refuses. Just then, Emily calls Dan after learning her father has revealed his true identity to Zoe. Emily asks to speak with her. During the conversation where she tries to convince Zoe to leave with Dan, it's revealed that Emily is in fact Agent Adams. Despite the discussion with Emily, Zoe wants Dan gone. On her way out of the house, Zoe's drawn back by the sound of a gunshot and sees Dan fighting with Carson. Intent on saving Dan, she releases Dave and Carol on Carson, giving Dan the upper hand. Dan then shoots Carson and leaves the house, taking Zoe along with him. At the FBI, Harper learns Waters has been tasked by Hamzad, who has a deal with the US government to bring Dan in alive. Afterward, he proceeds to tell Waters and Agent Adams that Hamzad wants Dan alive because he has questions that need answers. While telling them that Dan betrayed Hamzad by taking his wife, Balur, later known as Dan's wife, Abby, Harper also reveals his complicity in the betrayal of Hamzad by having helped Dan and Balur escape Afghanistan all those years ago. After that, Agent Adams suggests Waters set up a meeting with Hamzad so they could find out more about his demands. However, during the conversation, Agent Adams let slip subtle cues about her direct connection to the case, raising Harper and Waters' suspicion. Just then, the SWAT team reports that Zoe's house is empty. They also highlight on the evidence of violence, although there's nobody, as the injured Carson was able to escape with help from his friend, Mike. On Dan's behest, Zoe tries to relay her temporary absence to her son over the phone, but the call goes into voicemail. While at home with his family and Agent Adams, Harper gets informed that the agency has declared Dan and Zoe missing, given that they haven't been seen in 72 hours. Later that night, Emily reaches out to Dan and learns that he's in Colorado. She informs him about a meeting scheduled with Nina Kruger, Hamzad's lawyer. Dan tries to talk her out of attending, but Emily insists she'll be fine. When Dan and Zoe arrive in Montana, they take on new IDs and names, the same ones Dan and Balur used whenever they were in town. Meanwhile, Carson informs Harper there's a mole in his operation, since Dan was alert when he showed up, therefore increasing Harper's suspicion about Adams. However, both of them head over to the meeting with Nina as planned. There, Nina lets Harper know Hamzad intends to put out a memorandum stating that Harper aided Dan in his escape from the FBI. To save his skin, Harper tells her about Balur, and she agrees to convey his message to Hamzad. A while later, Nina informs him that Hamzad has agreed to another meeting and puts him on a plane to an unknown destination. Agent Adams comes along, even though her father is against it. Back in Montana, Dan returns home after a meeting with one of his employees, and Zoe issues him a letter of divorce, using her recently assumed identity as Dan's wife to her advantage. She threatens to divorce him and take half of everything he has, or be given a large sum of money to disappear from his life. While on the plane to Hamzad, Harper lets Emily know he's in on her secret and accuses her of being a criminal since she's in the FBI under a false identity. However, Emily shoots back, reminding him that he's a criminal as well for sending an assassin after her father just to prevent his participation in Hamzad's betrayal from coming to light. Meanwhile, believing Emily's in danger, Dan quickly agrees to Zoe's terms so he can get his focus on protecting his daughter. He asks Zoe to come along with him to Morocco, promising to explain everything to her, and she agrees. On the way to Morocco, Dan lets her in on the real reason Hamzad is after him, which is that he conspired with Balur, who back then also worked with the Soviets to wipe out enemy local tribes, to hide the location of a mineral mine of unimaginable value from Hamzad, as that would give him too much power once the Soviets would leave Afghanistan, a power that could corrupt him. Afterward, they make a stop at a hotel to drop off Dave and Carol before continuing their journey to Morocco, where Dan intends to get some help from an old contact. In a cafe, Boat calls Waters on the phone, informing him that Harper's missing and that he'll need his help to find him. Just then, Carson walks in and quizzes Boat about the mole in Harper's operation, and Boat comes clean, telling him he'd put her, Agent Adams, in there on Dan's request. Furthermore, he tells Carson about his father-like relationship to both Harper and Dan, and that he wants them gotten rid of to prevent anyone tracing his crime of placing an individual with a false identity in the FBI back to him. When Harper and Emily's plane lands, Hamzat immediately tests Harper to find out how much the FBI director knows. However, he doesn't get the information he's after and decides to release the memorandum. Harper then receives a phone call from his wife concerning the memorandum. She tells him there's a lawyer who can help and that he wants to speak with him. However, upon handing the phone over, the lawyer turns out to be Boat. He tells Harper he can help him, but only if he disposes of Emily. But Harper turns down the offer. Meanwhile, Dan and Zoe arrive at an island in Morocco. Leaving her at the bar, Dan goes to see Pavlovich, a Soviet captain he and Balur helped escape from Hamzat 30 years ago. Dan needs his help to kill Hamzat so he can save Emily. Meanwhile, Emily's decided to save Harper by giving herself up after she heard his grandson say an old man paid them a visit at home, indicating that Harper's family was being threatened. So, she convinces Harper to return home. However, when they get separated, Emily is taken by Carson and Waters, who are now working together on orders from Boat, leaving Harper with no choice but to comply with Boat's requests. Back in Morocco, Dan's meeting with Pavlovich doesn't go well, as Hamzat's lawyer Nina already got to him first and has him sided with them. Meanwhile, at the bar, Nina approaches Zoe, calling her by her real name, which scares Zoe. She tries to bring Zoe to her side, but Dan arrives shortly after and takes her back to their boat. On getting to the dock, they are met by Harper, who informs Dan that Emily is taken by the old man and that they are going to get her back. Harper informs Dan that Boat and Hamzat have arranged a plane for him, and that if he wants Emily released, he'd have to comply and get on the plane. After getting Harper to confirm that Boat would keep his own end of the bargain, Dan agrees to get on the plane. Then he tells Zoe she's free to live her life, but she tells him she'll only go home if he comes along. However, Dan is not willing to risk her life any longer, so he leaves her behind with some officers, while he and Harper, escorted by Moroccan secret police, head over to the airfield. However, along the way, a minor complication occurs. Waters calls Harper and tells him they've been surrounded by Hamzat's men, who has double-crossed them. After being given their location by Waters, Harper turns around and starts heading over to where Emily is held. Meanwhile, Carson is disposing of the men who had surrounded them. When Waters and Mike then drive out of their hideout, they get attacked by an old woman, who kills them both and takes Emily to Hamzat. While Dan and Harper make their way back, one of the secret police officers tagging along tells Harper of new orders to return to the airfield. The agents insist on the use of force if Harper doesn't comply. Unfazed, Dan and Harper decide to ignore these orders and go after Emily. So Dan loses the officers' cars following them and heads over to Emily's location. However, when they get there, they find Waters and Mike dead with no signs of Emily. At this point, Dan finally opens up to Harper, telling him that Emily is actually Hamzat's daughter, Parwana, and that he had brought her along with Balur when he left Afghanistan 30 years ago, and that she was the reason he couldn't kill Hamzat back then, since she was with them in the same room and why Hamzat has returned.